Stories have the ability to bring us together around a collective imagination and create a refuge where we can connect with other people and the world. This is why at Wimblu, we have set out to create spaces of community around our stories, to come together to navigate these uncertain times, connect with different perspectives, and imagine other possible worlds. These encounters are part of our efforts to connect the persons behind our stories and create a community of storytellers addressing the intersections of ecology and spirituality. These conversations allow us to delve deeper into the themes that each story explores, the creative processes involved, and the worldviews from which they emerge. Our guest today, Sara Dosa, is an award-winning documentary director and producer from the United States, whose interests lay in telling unexpected character-driven stories about ecology, economy, and community. She graduated from Wesleyan University and holds a master's in anthropology and international development economics from the London School of Economics. She is director of the film Fire of Love, an extraordinary love story of the intrepid French scientists Katia and Maurice Krafft, who dedicated their lives to the understanding of their greatest passion, volcanoes. On the other hand, Fernando Chaves is a Costa Rican film critic and writer. He is the artistic director of the Costa Rica International Film Festival. He was assistant curator of the Museum of Contemporary Art and Design of Costa Rica and writes for different platforms and media. He holds an MA in film programming and curating from Birkbeck University of London and a BA in journalism and audiovisual production from the Costa Rica University. He is also the writer of Wimblu's magazine creative documentary column and author of Can Volcanoes Love, a text about the film Fire of Love, featured on Volume 8, Desire. So thank you both for being here, taking the time, and I will pass the mic to Fernando.
Hello, thank you very much for all the team at Wimblu. I'm just really happy to be part of the things that you do because I think they touch upon very important subjects that I think need more space in our media and in our online discussions. And it's great that we can do this online as well. Because I think one of the most important or the most pressing issues we are facing right now is the need to realize that whatever happens in one side of the world will have an impact elsewhere. And although that might sound trite or like a cliche, it's actually something that we are seeing more and more every day, and that it's becoming inescapable. So I really want to thank you for that. Sarah, it's a pleasure to meet you, and it was a pleasure to write about your film, Fire of Love, which I hope many people can see or will feel motivated to see it soon. I would like to thank you, Sarah, for this space to discuss the film. I would like to start by saying something. I wrote a piece, and I the title is obviously provocative on purpose, like Can Volcanoes Love? Like, can inanimate objects feel emotions? And obviously we know the complexity behind that kind of thinking, but I would like to start by that simple question, uh, which is what is your relationship, your personal relationship with volcanoes, with this non-human, non-living beings that have caught your attention for long?
Mhm. Thank you for that question, Fernando, and just thank you for this conversation in general, and thank you to everyone at Wimblu. It's really an honor to be here. I also want to echo my gratitude for the work that you're all doing. I'm very inspired by it, and really grateful to be in conversation and in connection. And I guess leading off from that sentiment and into your question, volcanoes have taught me wordless amounts about how to live and how to love and how to understand the connections between things, all things in the world, as well as the mysteries, the uncertainties that we can never know. it's hard to say one thing that it's very difficult to encapsulate or to put on some sort of concise frame around my relationship with volcanoes, because I feel like it's ever evolving. But from this moment in time, I can just say that they've become phenomenal teachers to me. I think that I started out, actually, the first volcano that I ever met was in Costa Rica. I was a child and I had gone there on a family vacation with my family, and we saw Arenal. And I was terrified, quite frankly. I think that everything I'd heard about volcanoes were that they were scary, a danger, something to run away from. And as a little one, I have this memory of hiding in the car, trying to not be present. And I feel like that's the opposite of my relationship now, actually, with volcanoes. I think that over the course of making Fire of Love and getting to experience this near supernatural force through the lens of the Krafts, who were so deeply in love with volcanoes and pulled in by the mystery, really pulled in by what they did not know as much as what they longed to know. That gave me kind of a hunger for that same kind of passion. And as an adult, I should say that outside of viewing the footage, when we were on tour with Fire of Love, as well as during an artist residency in Iceland, when we were making Fire of Love, I had the pleasure of seeing volcanoes myself, and I was met with this true feeling of primordial creation in a way that really made me think about the fire, the sense of connectivity, the fault lines, the aliveness of the earth, and the small presence of humans on top of that thin crust. Like I felt that so palpably in person, and that's an idea we hope to communicate in the film. But it's one that I think will always live within me. There's an awe in that, and feeling one's precarity and smallness, but at once that deep connectivity to kind of these forces of creation and destruction all at once. So I could go on and on and on, but maybe I'll leave it there for now.
No, thank you for that, because I think that also speaks to an atmosphere that you are able to build through the film, which of course is very interesting because you are dealing with archival material for the most part, archival material related to a couple, Maurice and Katia Krafft, who dedicated their lives to volcanoes and who really understood very deeply or very intimately that kind of forces and primordial energies that you are talking about. So I obviously want to know how you got to know about their story, their personal story, which you lay out quite emotionally, I must say, in the film, in Fire of Love. But that is also a story that has been told many times. So I want to know, on the one hand, how you met them, so to speak, but also how you managed to craft this film in which, even though they are rather well known, you paint them in a new light. You sort of give them a very different feeling from what you might think at first hand.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I first met Katia and Maurice actually when I was finishing up the film I made just before Fire of Love. That was a film called The Seer and the Unseen, and it tells the story of an Icelandic woman who is in communication with spirits of nature, which in Iceland are called elves. That film, we think of it as a film that's kind of told through the lens of magic realism, which is very much a strong cultural force in Iceland, and very fitting of our protagonist, Raka, who communicates with elves. And we thought it would be important to situate this largely verite portrait of this woman and this journey she's on in the context of Iceland as this alive volcanic island, which it is, of course. We wanted to open the film thus with archival imagery of erupting volcanoes in Iceland. And it was through that research that we came across Katia and Maurice Krafft. Their footage of erupting Icelandic volcanoes is unlike anything we had seen. And we instantly wanted to know more about them. And once we found out that they were a couple in love with each other and absolutely enthralled by volcanoes, we thought, oh, there's got to be a deeper story there. And the more we learned about them, the more we realized we wanted to make a film about them. Most notably, when we came across a passage in a book that Maurice wrote, Maurice says, "For me, Katia and Volcanoes, it is a love story." And we felt like with that sentence, he was giving us kind of a thesis statement or a lens through which we could understand his life. He was saying, I live in a love triangle with my partner, Katia, and volcanoes. And that got us very excited narratively to think about structure, to think about what it means to tell a love triangle story with two humans and volcanoes as the third in this relationship. That opened up a lot of possibilities too in terms of kind of the artistic grammar of the film. Katia and Maurice were very influenced by the French New Wave, for example, and that shows up a lot in their own work, from Maurice's cinematography to the way Katia writes. Katia's writing, for example, reminded us a lot of the narration one would find in an Agnes Varda film or Francois Truffaut. And Maurice's cinematography has kind of the hallmarks of kind of French New Wave cinematography. So I'll just say we wanted to embrace the influences that spoke to them in terms of how we were beginning to craft the film. And again, putting the love triangle, which shows up in so many French New Wave films, at the heart of ours as well. So we were coming up with kind of the beginnings of pieces and clues of how to tell this story in a way that felt like we were embracing their spirit, but also being upfront about the fact that all archives are limited for all kinds of reasons, some deeply political. One can make the argument that it's all political. But I'll just say, we wanted to be upfront about what we didn't know, what we didn't have, because there's so much that we never could know. The mysteries that we could never answer about Katia and Maurice's own life also resonated with the mysteries of love and the mysteries of volcanoes. So I'll just say there is these thematic elements that began to align. Working in deep collaboration with my incredible team, my editors and producers, we began to kind of find this collage form to this film that seemed to kind of echo the themes. And we hoped in some way also mimic a kind of geologic structure of sediments, you know, the various levels of archival material building on to create the story.
Thank you. And you also, it's very interesting to know about this filmic approach to their story as well, in the sense that you went into this archive through the lens of how they thought about film as their tool for research, which is very interesting, and which is also, I must point out, something that obviously in the past decade and a half perhaps has become very prominent: film as a tool for research. And apart from that, I do want to highlight something that I found very beautiful in the film, which is the sense of how tactile it is, how you focus on the textures and just like the very materiality, obviously, of not only of the film itself, but also of the volcanoes, and how the crafts are completely immersed, body and soul, in that landscape. I wanted you for you to speak a little bit about that.
Sure. I feel endlessly, profoundly lucky to have gotten to be so immersed in their footage. It was absolutely captivating. The compositions were extraordinary, the boldness of their shots too, and just in terms of how close they were to these mind-bogglingly hot places. It's truly extraordinary what they were able to do, and specifically, yeah, as you mentioned, the materiality of it. They were shooting on 16 millimeter, which is, when you think about how 16 millimeter or how celluloid works, it's all mineralization. This is something Deborah Stratman, another filmmaker who's one of my heroes, she has a film that came out last year called Last Things, and she shot on 16 millimeter and has beautiful things to say about the kind of geologic process, actually, of working in 16 millimeter, and in terms of how it relates to mineralization and light. And there's something that I think is so beautiful and fitting about the fact that the Kraffts, these kind of geologic filmmakers, the fact that they were using that format as well. Granted, that was the technology of the time, but I love the various layers that can communicate in and of itself. And I do think that you can really feel it in the frame, not just the geology, the minerality, but the love, which, one could say is also a element of nature, just in terms of how close they were getting up to the shots, and how sentient they render the landscape. I think for me, that's probably one of the things that made me most excited about working with their footage, is just how in every frame you could see that they understood the earth as utterly alive, as volcanoes, as having an ontology, an existent, a being unto itself, not necessarily anthropomorphizing it, but acknowledging its sentience. And that was something that was just so captivating and exciting to get to play with from a filmmaking perspective.
I also, yes, you mentioned it very, very vividly. You just described that sort of approach that they themselves had to the filmmaking process. But I was really surprised by some of the decisions that they made. Like you mentioned, the framing, the composition, like it, quote unquote, it makes no sense if you're doing a
Yeah.
scientific record of
Yeah.
geological processes.
Mhm.
But then at the same time, that's precisely what
Yeah.
makes these images resonate with us and reveal something about the sense that this is the the very core of the earth. This is the very fulcrum where life, geological life, so to speak, begins. And just seeing that up close, I find it very poetic, and I find that very, very moving. How did your vision of this geological history change over the course of doing the film and talking about the film for so long now?
Yeah, it's the vision has changed a lot from beginning to the end, for sure. At the very beginning, I should say that I had hoped that the film would not have any narration, actually. Uh, and yeah, it would not have any animation or these other elements. So it was my initial hope that the film would be carried by Maurice and Katia's voices alone and their footage alone. However, once we received the archive and began watching it, we really came into contact with all of the limitations of the archive. But rather being stuck in the limitations or trying to paper over the limitations to pretend like we didn't have them, my team and I really started to try to listen deeply. We found it more as like a prompt to how to engage deeper, how to understand Katia and Maurice with greater depth and greater complexity. And what that did is it opened up new creative possibilities about how to tell the story. And one of them we realized would have to be narration. Kind of going back to one of your earlier questions about kind of the differences of our film versus some other films about the Kraffts. It was essential for us to tell a love story. That was something that came out in our research, as well as from the Kraffts themselves in their own writing. We interviewed many members of their family, for example, and friends and loved ones who knew them very deeply, and everyone seemed to agree that love was the driving force of their life. And thus, if we were going to tell one of the myriad stories that you could tell about the Kraffts, that should be central. So I'll just say, that wasn't coming through. It came through in their cinematography, like you could feel their love for volcanoes. But since Katia and Maurice were rarely in front of the camera, it was very difficult to actually capture the love story between the two of them. And that's where we thought, okay, if we can bring this in through narration, if we could come up with other elements that still felt like they were in line with their kind of spirit, in line with their way in the world, then it could be an appropriate technique. So I'm kind of going on a tangent, but I'll just say these various limitations ended up breeding new ideas for creative elements to embrace. But every single decision kind of went back to kind of what would Katia and Maurice do? How would they approach this? We tried to invoke them every step of the way as our creative guides. And that was incredibly useful and also just deeply meaningful. It also kind of led to a feeling of unrequitedness because I don't have Katia and Maurice to talk to. They passed away 30 years before we ever began this project. And we too, the more we did research on them, the more we did research on volcanoes, the more we would be confronted with the facts of we just don't know. And we were utterly humbled by kind of the weight and the breadth and the depth of the uncertainties. But there's a beautiful surrender that can come with that too. And that was something that we ultimately wanted to put into the film as much as possible, not just in terms of kind of volcanoes and love and the Kraffts, but kind of hint at our own process and hopefully say something about archival filmmaking as well in doing so. So I think I veered off course from your original question. So my apologies.
No, I don't think you veered that much, but I do want to bring out that what you just said about archival filmmaking. In what sense do you think, or what did it make you think about the process of building a film, constructing a film, even weaving a film from this kind of archival material?
It was an incredibly difficult process, and it was the most gratifying creative process I've encountered all at the same time. And I think oftentimes those things go hand in hand. The archive that Katia and Maurice shot, we were working with about 200 hours of 16 millimeter footage that they shot. None of it had sound. And many of the shots themselves were very short, like 2 seconds, 4 seconds, maybe 10 seconds if we were lucky. And I have phenomenal editors. Aaron Casper and Jocelyn Chaput are just absolute geniuses and joys of collaborators to work with. But it was extremely difficult for them to piece together any sense of like a coherent scene because of the lack of sound, because of the lack of Katia and Maurice in the frame, and because of the length of the shots. But again, going back to the idea that these limitations breed new creative opportunities, that caused us to really lean into associative editing, which is, again, one of the kind of hallmarks of the French New Wave, as well as many other kind of creative traditions. But that was something, again, when we were looking at French New Wave as a guide, it was very helpful for us to embrace that style of editing, particularly in terms of montage and creating evocative juxtapositions. All to say, there's a lot I could say about archival filmmaking, but in this specific context, it's interesting. I feel like almost the tools of verite filmmaking, we embraced those and applied them to archival filmmaking. For me, the heart of verite filmmaking, it's about deep listening. It's about trying to listen as deeply as possible to the participants in the film, and to work with them to find a story that feels representative. And in this case, we couldn't listen directly to Katia and Maurice since they had passed, but we had to find all the various ways to listen to their archives and bring out the story in these other ways. I think embracing the gaps and understanding how the gaps are created, whether it's an act of political erasure, which is very common in terms of archives, or if it's, in the case of Katia and Maurice, there's a lot of footage that literally melted away or was lost to time. But understanding the holes in the record, why they exist, how to invoke those interstices or not, can be a really meaningful part of the storytelling process, especially in a film about kind of the mysteries of the universe as well.
Yeah, I find that very, very evocative as well. I While watching the film, and it's something that comes up often when talking about images of volcanoes and volcanic landscapes. I've always found it a bit jarring that it's very, very often that these landscapes are described as alien-like, as scenes from another planet, Whereas in reality, they are the closest we have to, like I said before, like to the heart, to the nucleus, to the center of our own planet. Uh, uh, so obviously going in as directly into it, it's obviously very moving. But um, what do you think about that distance that we place between ourselves and volcanoes?
I love that question. I think there's actually a quote from my last film, The Seer and the Unseen. Raka, our protagonist in that film, she says, the way you see the land determines your relationship to the land. And there's a lot in that quote that I think there's a lot of wisdom there. I think that the narration of landscape, the understanding of landscape, can reveal a tremendous amount of kind of political and economic entanglements from which the viewer is coming from. So I could see how many people who don't live in direct relationship with volcanoes would view it as alien, as scary, as other. But I'm very inspired by the many kind of narratives and stories and records of people who live in deep relationship with volcanoes, that understand volcanoes as life-giving, as a symbol of fertility, a symbol of generosity, as well as destruction. There's so much complexity there. And there's all kinds of fascinating and deeply troubling accounts, for example, of during colonial conquests throughout what we today call the Americas, of conquistadors coming upon volcanoes and thinking that there's molten gold inside the volcanoes rather than lava. So I'll just say, like, I feel like depicting, deconstructing, and understanding these different ways of representing nature can teach us so much about kind of the political, cultural, and economic history of our world today. But there's something, bringing it back to the Kraffts, in the way that they saw volcanoes. I feel like their depiction, their representation through the camera, was so multifaceted. They deeply loved them, but they really understood them as these boundary breaking, unclassifiable forces, which for me personally, I really loved. There's a quote in the film where Maurice says that, that you can't classify volcanoes. And that's something that seems particularly radical for a scientist, and especially that age of science. Taxonomy, classifications, categorizations was a particularly meaningful school of thought. So I love kind of thinking just of volcanoes as almost like these rebel forces that can't be contained, that can't be easily classified, that have myriad representations. But when we kind of get behind like how people come to understand them, it can say so much about who we are as humans.
You touched upon a subject, a topic I wanted to bring out as well, which I did mention in the column, but I want to expand upon. We were just talking about, this sense of volcanoes as being other, apart from us. But it's also true that particularly recently, it's the eye of extractivism that has defined our way of regarding and thinking about volcanoes. And I've been thinking about that a lot recently. I'm currently in Oxford, which I hadn't visited before, so I've been going through all the tourist attractions and so on, and looking at every sign and all the museums and so on. I'm thinking about the film as well because I knew we had this conversation coming up, and going to the Museum of Natural History and thinking about that sense of 400, 500, 600 years ago, not knowing what volcanoes meant exactly, or how they behaved, or how they interacted with the rest of the ecosystem, and then many centuries later, coming to a point where they're only regarded as a source for energy or a tourist attraction. And so I've been thinking about that a lot, and I would like to know what you think about that sort of history of our relationship to volcanoes.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there's something alarming and also sad about instrumentalizing like the most powerful, literally the most powerful force on the planet for tourists or for energy. Of course, yeah, geothermal energy can be a meaningful alternative to other sources of energy, even though it's replete with its own environmental hazards. Um, but I think it's that quest for utter knowability, that the kind of the grand project of mapping territory, that creates kind of the space, so to speak, for extractivism, for kind of that capitalist mindset of like, how can this become a market? And I'm way oversimplifying very complex processes, but I think that's where narratives of the earth as sentient, as the planet as alive, as centering the non-human through storytelling, is so essential because it resists that kind of capitalization of nature as a resource for human consumption, be it experiential consumption as a tourist or actual consumption in the form of geothermal energy. So I think I'm very inspired by people like the Krafts who do center the sentience of volcanoes, and see them as busting out of the walls of a proverbial museum, for example. I find the Natural History Museum so fascinating in terms of how, thinking about how nature is represented and had been, all the myriad projects to contain nature, in these various projects of conquest. But I'll just say the people who have for centuries been telling stories that center non-human nature, that show deep relationship, ecological entanglements. It's like, that's the work that I am personally most inspired by, and like look towards as leadership for our planet in crisis.
Thank you. Going back to the film itself and to the project for you as a filmmaker, I would like to know what it's been like to travel around with the film and to hear what people think about it and to hear. I mean, I was wondering if you had the chance, I'm sure you have, to talk about the film with people who met the Krafts and who even worked with them.
Yeah, it's been a wonderful experience getting to travel around the world with the film. I'm very lucky to have had National Geographic Documentary Films distribute the film. They were a great partner for us. They put it out in theaters, allowed it to play at festivals all around the world. And in doing that travel, I was so happy to have gotten to meet so many people who were touched by the Krafts and volcanoes. And it's so interesting making an archival film. And an archive is an alive thing too. Since we released the film, I should say that many people have actually contacted me and sent me photos of the Krafts, of saying like, I met them in Hawaii in 1983. Like, here's some photos that I took from my own camera, or someone in Indonesia meeting them at the base of a volcano. So I'll just say the archive has actually only grown because this has become an opportunity for people to kind of consolidate their own materials. But aside from that, I should say that probably there's been many moving experiences, but one of the highlights of the journey we took with the film was the kind of homecoming premiere in France of the film. Bertrand Krafft, Maurice's older brother, he gave a beautiful introduction to the film. He had been, of course, a consultant along the way, and his perspective and his blessing on the materials and our approach was key to our whole process. But for our French premiere, it was actually at the Louvre. And we were particularly excited about that because Katia and Maurice had been celebrated as scientists in their day, but having this film be at the Louvre, at this kind of temple of art in many ways, we were so excited for them to be celebrated as artists, as poets of cinema, so to speak. But Bertrand's introduction that he gave, it brought me to tears. I'm getting emotional just thinking about it now, because the first thing he ever said to me when we first spoke on the phone back in 2020, he said, Katia and Maurice must not be forgotten. And that was something I took so seriously, and trying to tell their story and pay tribute to their memory and their legacy laid at the heart of everything we did. And so to have him presenting the film like in their home country, in this place of art, for many of their family and friends and people who had worked with them, it was deeply, deeply meaningful. So I'll particularly cherish that one. And I'll just also say that I got to tour around with many members of my team. It was such a collaborative process, and I'm so indebted to them, all of them. So getting to like be a band on the road together was also just really fun.
It's important to highlight this kind of, not only of filmmaking, but also the discussions that emerge around the films, especially in a moment like this, when the harm that we have caused becomes so apparent and so obvious at all moments. But I was also thinking about sort of like the deep memory of humankind and the relationships to volcanoes, and how that's something that we have been researching recently more intensively, like how volcanoes have shaped our history, but not only like the geological aspect, but also human history. And I find that uh, very interesting. And I find that also uh, bringing a film like this to audiences now is a way of rekindling that kind of curiosity about what surrounds us. Um, what do you think, or how do you think that this kind of film, apart from obviously the artistic joy in creating it, uh, can help to do in terms of those discussions? Like, how are we positioned in this world now? Where are volcanoes now?
Uh, that's an excellent. I love all your questions. I just have to stop for a second to say, like, these are such excellent questions. I would love to take so much time and think deeply and write essays based on each of these. But yeah, that's a great question. From my perspective, I do see us in this horrific planetary crisis that's, of course, embedded and compounded within overlapping crises. And I think that volcanoes can teach us, again, about the aliveness of the earth, and about kind of what you said at the outset of this conversation about how connected we all are, how something that happens over here deeply affects something over here. There are literally fault lines, tectonic plates that connect us all, even if we're not readily aware of it. There's a very powerful metaphor in that connectivity, and quite a literal reality to that connection. So I think that alone can help infuse a sense of the ecological entanglements, that if that's where we put our attention, rather than on individual issues, but rather how we come together, how we're all entangled in each other and non-human realities. I think that kind of thinking can help spur deeper thinking and more creative thinking about how to transition out of some of the problematic, some of the issues that stemming hundreds of years until now, that are kind of wreaking havoc on the planet today. So I'll just say, I feel like volcanoes, both in terms of their literal and metaphoric interpretations, are deeply meaningful in that regard. Yeah, and I think too, just the fact, again, coming back to this idea of resisting categorization is a extremely powerful way of thinking. embracing the mysteries, embracing the uncertainties. There's certainly a lot just in terms of kind of one's own philosophical orientation towards living a meaningful life, given the uncertainties of our world and tumult. It's more than tumult. So from that standpoint, there's a lot to learn. But I think also in terms of embracing, the spectrums, that which cannot be categorized is a deeply meaningful and important political act as well.
I would like to know if any of you, of the people who joined us, have any questions. But I would just like to, while they prepare their questions, I was just wondering something very, I guess, personal, which is what are there any pieces of works of art or writing or anything at all from across time that uh, that has inspired regarding volcanoes, obviously, that has inspired you or that has made you curious about how that work of art or literature came to be regarding volcanoes?
Oh, there's so many things. It's difficult to choose. I think I'll share just one thing because it influenced some of our artistic choices with the animation in the film. Katia and Maurice collected thousands and thousands of illustrations of volcanoes. And that was something we wanted to kind of nod to in the animation, the paper cutout animation that you see in Fire of Love. But there was one drawing that they had from, I believe his name is Althenius Kircher or Kirchner, who was kind of a polymath living in the 1600s. And he had a theory that inside the earth were dragons, and that the earth was made up of these various tunnels too, and there's these like tremendous gusts of wind that would course through these underground tunnels, and it was through that and the breathing of fire from the dragons that created volcanoes. That was one of his many theories. And there's something about that and these illustrations that I saw of this theory that always captivated my imagination. And I felt like taught me so much about languages of science through time. He was thought of as a scientist, and from today's perspective, many people would think of like dragons in the middle of the earth. Like that's utterly unscientific, but I think what it shows is the myth, that's the mythic languages that are at once part of the scientific project as well, and how those things can mix together and cohere into a type of language of the unknown. And I find that so fascinating. But I would love to go back in time to find out more about his process of understanding the dragons and what that was like and what those questions he was asking at that time were. But there's so many things that I could go off on.
Yeah, of course. Well, no, and also thinking about that, obviously you think about how in different cultures volcanoes were either deities or sites of spirituality. Thinking about, well, now that I mentioned volcanoes' influence on art or on human thinking, famously the eruption of Mount Tambora, 1816, the year without summer. I mean, how one eruption and thousands of miles from Europe transformed art history and the pigments used in painting. So you think about like, wow, how many things could we explain to this? Or even thinking about beautiful. I mean, I remember the poem by Emily Dickinson about volcanoes that she mentions. There's moldering anguish, and it's such a beautiful expression. It's such a wonderful way of saying it. It's moldering anguish. Like the poem starts like, I have never seen volcanoes, but when travelers tell how those mountains are, I mean, so thinking about that, like Emily Dickinson famously not moving from her room, uh, being able to sort of interiorize all that thinking and all the mythology about volcanoes and expressing it in a poem. I just found that very beautiful. I think, yeah, sorry.
Oh,
Go
no, I
ahead.
was just agreeing. That is beautiful. I love that. I'll have to read that poem.
I think we have questions.
Well, yes, I wanted to ask Sara about the relation between how do you see the relation between science and art? Um, Being a social scientist, and also like this film being about two scientists that kind of take that tells this story, but the story has a lot of layers that link us with art, culture, the way we see nature, how we relate with nature. So it's more about science. It's not only about science. I know science is like a point of departure. How do you see that relation? How does it fit your creative processes? I'm interested in knowing that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Kind of similar to what we were just talking about. I do think of science as well. I think one particular thread of the vast universe that is science is how science is a language that speaks to the unknown, or can be a language that speaks to the unknown. Can provide pathways of inquiry and languages for exploration in a way that I think can dovetail with cultural languages around the unknown, and specifically tropes of myth. And that's something that really interests me as a filmmaker, is how those things can come together to both tell stories. Science is in that way of thinking of it as a language of the unknown. It thus can tell a story about the unknown, as does myth, as does poetry. And for us, kind of where kind of science and love aligned in Fire of Love was through the idea of understanding. We have this line in the film that's actually was inspired by Thich Nhat Hanh, the Zen Buddhist monk, where we say, understanding is love's other name. And that is in the scene that's about Katia and Maurice really embracing kind of their early days as scientists, but they're also falling in love with each other and falling in love with the mysteries of the earth. And so I'll just say, like, this is kind of my long way of saying that I think of science as just one of the myriad ways that we can attempt to approach that which we can never fully understand. We hope to understand, but we know the closer we get to understanding, the more we realize we can never understand. And there's something in the vast, complex, dynamic scientific process that I think can provide useful frameworks for getting us to understand those paradoxes and that complexity.
I also wanted to ask a question. Thank you for this conversation. It has been lovely so far. You mentioned at some point, or some ways in which you described the volcanoes and their force. You said that they were like rebel forces that can't be contained. And then you put it like very beautifully that there is something alarming and sad about instrumentalizing the most powerful force of the planet. I wrote it down because it's so precise. And I'm asking, like, I want to point this out because these are some of the ideas as well that made us include your film in an edition about desire, because you could also be saying these things about desire, right? That it's one of the most powerful forces of the planet, and it's sort of a rebel force that can be contained, right? And so for us, there was like a really obvious relationship between your film and the theme of desire, but I'm wondering if it was present for you as you were making the film, and how, if it was.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I love these questions. Yeah, I'm really grateful for all of this. It's giving me so much food for thought. But yes, so that really was thinking about desire and thinking about love, and the complexities and even like the toxicities too of love. Was something that was very important to our process as a team when we were crafting the story. We were specifically thinking about Katia and Maurice's relationship, and how, while they're a team, they're also very different people, and they had very different relationships to desire, and how that played out in the relationship towards volcanology and just living life with volcanoes. Maurice's desire burned quite hot, to use. We used way too many fire and volcano puns when we were talking about the film. But I'll just say Maurice was his desire was driven in this particularly intense kind of experiential way. He just wanted to get so close to volcanoes, and he was willing to risk his life in order to get that close. For Katia, her desire was more driven through understanding. Not that Maurice's wasn't, but she did approach it from a more methodological standpoint. She wanted to know volcanoes, and so her desire was not quite as infused with that same fervor. But some people have described Maurice's desire as akin to madness. And I think in that way, that's something that can't be contained. That is akin to, again, like these great unclassifiable forces that don't behave according to rules. And Katia, of course, broke tons of rules herself too. But I do think that desire in her case functions a little differently. But we were trying to play with that as a force too, to kind of drive the narrative of the film, as well as kind of the rhythms, just the overall feel and experience of the film. So I'm really glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, thank you. I think it was so present for us, like from the first minute that we saw the film. Yeah. And if I may just throw in an extra question, because one other thing you were speaking about before is about these mythic languages or these mythic stories around volcanoes. And it feels like this is also what you are doing in your film, sort of creating a new modern myth, around these characters, around volcanoes themselves. And I was wondering if you also see it that way, that filmmaking is a way of myth making also.
I love that you said that, because we had nicknames and just shorthand for all of the scenes in the film, and we have one particular scene that we call myth making. But we did kind of theories of myth were guiding our entire approach to making the film. Part of that was because Katia and Maurice themselves were extremely interested in collecting myths about volcanoes. They had a beautiful book that was all dedicated towards the stories people told, specifically people who live in relationship with volcanoes all around the world. And those are just amazing stories that really speak to the truth of volcanoes and how supernatural they do seem. But also there's something just about the project of cinema. It's, cinema, it's a time-based medium. It seeks to be immortal, so to speak. Of course, it's not. It can erode and wither and fall away. But the fact that it's based on time, 24 seconds per frame, the fact that it hypothetically has this impermanence to it, that made it seem ripe for a story about myth. Katia and Maurice knew that their lives could be, over in an instant, but by capturing it on film, they could, in a way, live forever. And that was something that we as a team began to notice. Like, the more footage we watched in the edit room, the more we realized they seemed to be encoding their own story on film, knowing that they could die. And thus, in a way, they were saying, they were ensuring this kind of mythic existence beyond death. And we found that just so beautiful. There was something almost freeing about how they lived life, because they knew that they could live on and at once be so reconciled in who they were to know that they could die at any moment, which of course we all could, but they're doing so much more palpably living on a volcano. So.
Well, thank you everybody for being here again and for taking the time. This was a great conversation. I meant to tell you before, I really love your lava color shirt that you wear today. Well, if there's now any other question, I think we can wrap up. It's been a pleasure getting to know you a little bit more, Sara. Thank you, Fernando, for finding a cafe that was open in Oxford at this time.
Okay, well, thank you all so much. I'm so grateful for your deeply thoughtful questions and for your time. It's wonderful to get to know you all and your work, and I really appreciate you having me here.
No, thank you very much for the film and for this conversation.
If you want to support our project, you can share this episode, visit our digital magazine wimblu.com, subscribe to our newsletter, or join our Patreon community where you can access exclusive content starting at $3 a month. Your support allows us to create and share content that reimagines a fair and healthy world for all life forms.